For today's video, we're going to be putting Lugia V-Star in the spotlight for the 2024 World Championships. This was the most played deck day one at the NAIC, and it didn't convert all that well. It actually didn't have a great tournament run, to be honest with you. It was public enemy #1 going into the event, and many people came with their techs in droves, and partly that's why Lugia didn't have the performance many people expected towards the NAIC. But once again, looking at online data heading into the Shrouded Fable meta, it's early days of course, but it does look promising for Lugia. Its matchup spread is still reasonable, and there's once again murmurings of this archetype having a big showing at Worlds. Let's get into the general strategy of Lugia, and it revolves around the Summoning Star V-Star power on the Lugia here, where during your turn you may put up to 2 colourless Pokemon that don't have a rule box from your discard pile onto your bench directly, and that means that Archeops, the otherwise very awkward fossil Pokemon that's a stage 2, would be just impossible to get in play, but now we can summon them both into play on turn 2 of the game, accessing the incredible Primal Turbo ability, allowing us once during our turn to search our deck for up to 2 special energy cards and attach them to one of your Pokemon. So as soon as we summon, we get access to all sorts of expensive attack cost style Pokemon, but also can benefit from many secondary effects on a lot of these colourless special energy that are seen heavily within the list. We have Gift Energy, so when our Pokemon are KO'd, we can draw until we have 7 cards in our hand, protecting us nicely around Iono. We have Mist Energy, which can prevent all effects of attacks used by your opponent's Pokemon done to the Pokemon this card is attached to. That can protect us against all sorts of things, but most notably right now, things like damage counter placement from Dragapult EX's attack, which can be copied via Regidrago. And then we have our ace spec in the deck list, the Legacy Energy. This opens up a couple different attackers for us because it provides any type of energy, but only one at a time. That means that Iron Hands is a mainstay in the list as a 1 count, so that you can have access to the Amp You Very Much attack in order to take additional prize cards. And at the same time, Legacy Energy says that your opponent takes 1 less prize card if they KO the Pokemon this card is attached to by damage from an attack. So it's not guaranteed to work, but if the opponent does have to attack into that Legacy Energy and take the KO, they're taking 1 less prize card for their efforts, making Lugia very capable at racing in the current format, with high damage output single prizes like Chien-Pao, and Iron Hands, which is a multi-prizer but is kind of reduced down to a single prize Pokemon thanks to the ace spec. It also means that Miraidon, which is already just a very good consistency card in our deck, can be used alongside the Legacy Energy to Aqua Return and shuffle this Pokemon back into the deck, again denying those easy prize cards from opponents. Lugia itself isn't too shabby of an attacker. That Tempest Dive does 220 damage output, which we know is still very useful into a number of EX Pokemon, as well as basic V Pokemon. So it's certainly going to get into the mix, because you're always going to have to try and get a V-Star on turn 2 of the game. Let's have a look at the matchup data for Lugia then. Now this is in the Twilight Masquerade format, so the month of July, but man does it look appealing for Lugia. You have one very unfavourable matchup in Miraidon, but everything else in format of the top contenders are even or favourable matchups for the Lugia archetype. You're reasonable into those stage 2 decks. You're going to be the pace setter here, no doubt. It's going to be up to them to try and combine some hand disruptors and counter catchers whilst getting their stage 2s online under an immense amount of pressure. To my surprise, the Lost Zone box matchup is even. Now, I'm terrified of Iron Hands and Iron Thorns in the Lost Zone box players lists, but Lugia does have means around Iron Thorns that I'll talk about in a moment. The Raging Bolt's also an even matchup. Yes, they have early tempo at their disposal, but we have single prizes which can respond into them, and we have our Legacy Energy as well that can reduce the amount of prizes the opponent is taking. One of the biggest boasts of Lugia, I think, is that you're good into both of the controlling archetypes, the Pidgeot control and the Snorlax blocking deck, mostly because you just have this insane energy acceleration at your disposal, which means you have massive high damage output options to get through even tanky walling Pokemon. And of course you have those Jet Energy, which is great at getting around the block effect from Snorlax itself. You're also very decent into the Regidrago V-Star matchup, and I think that's why many people are looking towards Lugia for the World Championships as a counterpick to the other top V-Star of the format, the Regidrago archetype, which has been really picking up in popularity. Thanks to the likes of V-Guard Energy and Mist Energy, we can really neuter the effectiveness of Dragapult's attacking options. Also pretty reasonable into the Chien-Pao matchup, and it also looks like you're happy to see the Ancient Box deck. Onto a skeleton decklist then, it's pretty simple. We have the Lugia and maximum copies of the Archeops, as well as our other attacking options, the Chien-Pao, the Blood Moon Ursaluna, which is a very great late-game attacking Pokemon that is very efficient if the opponent has taken a number of prize cards. That means we can be very aggressive at throwing our energy onto these Chien-Pao for high damage output plays, using Iron Hands throughout the matchup, that sort of stuff, knowing that we have a very late-game Ursaluna which can close out the game, even with just 1 energy or sometimes even 0 energy attached to it. The only item cards that make it into Lugia are Bull Search cards, so that you can not only get Archeops into hand, but also have means of discarding them, either via the Ultra Balls themselves, or some of your supporter effects like Professor's Research. You'll notice there's only 2 copies of Professor's Research in my Skeleton 60, but we're going to supplement this either with increased counts of research itself, or look towards the Carmine supporter, which I'll mention in a moment. We're at a 16 count of energy. I think that's actually the lowest you can possibly go with Lugia. I think adding a 17th is certainly reasonable, and if we are going to do that, it would be an extra copy of V-Guard or Miss Energy that I'd look towards first. There's also the 1 copy of the Jacques supporter. It's not going to show up in any other archetype in the format, but in this deck specifically, it does have its uses. It searches for 2 evolution Pokemon, and there's a lot of ways you can go about getting towards your summoning star thanks to this supporter usage that you can oftentimes grab with Luminous Sign from Luminion. Filling out those final slots then, I think there are a few big debates for the Lugia V-Star players. The first one is whether or not you want to play Carmine in your deck. Carmine is a supporter that you can use on your first turn going first, and Lugia wants to go first whenever it wins the coin flip. That's its preferred choice. It allows you to discard your hand and draw 5 cards. Obviously a weaker effect than Professor's Research, but having the immediacy of being able to use this card on turn 1 just gives you extra reach in those opening stages. It can safeguard you against some aggressive archetypes like Raging Bolt, in that you can establish a second Lugia V, or even if you're just whiffing Lugia, it lets you see 5 cards deeper in your deck to try and get there. And there are situations where you will also have Archeops in those hands, so finding means of discarding Archeops as early as the first turn of the game can leave you so much less to do on that second turn of the game, with effectively 2 uses of supporter even if you've gone first. The obvious downside of Carmine, however, is that it's only 5 cards. And Lugia is kind of at its brickiest the earlier on it is in the game, before you've had the chance to use Archeops to thin your deck of all your energy cards. So there is a debate over how many Carmine to play, if any, compared to the tried and trusted Professor's Research, which is a more safe 7 cards dig. Then we have the debate of stadium cards. Now, Temple of Sinnoh is a really awkward stadium, so it's very important for us to have an amount of bounces within our deck. Typically, you see Lugia's land on a 2 count of stadiums, and the big debate is between Mesagoza, which allows you to flip coins for more Pokemon search, and Jamming Tower, which can shut down opponents' tools. The Jamming Tower can obviously help against hit point buffing cards, but it also has upside at denying Forest Seal Stone and TM Evolution against some setup decks in the opening turns, if you happen to see it early on. And the final debate is around additional ball search cards which can come into the deck. Very often you see 2 counts of Great Ball coming in to supplement the archetype, but with some new inclusions from Shrouded Fable, there might be a real argument on our hands whether or not we should play some count of Nest Ball instead of or in addition to Great Ball within our lists. Other than padding out our deck with just additional consistency cards, because we are at the core just a very combo-centric deck, the deck is incredible if you get to summon on turn 2 and terrible if you don't. So you really are filling many of your slots with just additional ball search supporters and stadium cards here. But there are still some other attacking options, and I think it's going to be really important to play either Fluttermane or Iron Bundle in your deck. Both of these serve as answers to the Iron Thorns EX. An Iron Thorns in the active position prevents your Lugia from using Summoning Star, which requires us either to Iron Bundle and push it to the bench, or to use Midnight Fluttering from Fluttermane to turn off the Iron Thorns so that we are still able to summon. The big upside of Fluttermane here is if there are going to be quad Iron Thorns based decks, you can still find a way of getting your Summoning Star going, and you add a little extra disruption to certainly some Lossone archetypes if they remain in format. Whereas Iron Bundling the list basically folds to a quad Thorns, but has upside in basically every other matchup, because sometimes just pushing a chunky Pokemon out the way can give you avenues to take additional prizes, and at the end of the day we are a racing archetype. As for some other Pokemon that can sometimes find their way into the deck lists, we have the Weirdeer V. When this Pokemon moves from the bench to the active, we can move any energy from your other Pokemon onto it, and it does a 40 times multiplier for each energy attached to this Pokemon. I think the big selling point of Weirdeer V is just how aggressively your opponent will try and take out your Archeops. It means that very often your Chinchino isn't doing its main purpose, which is reaching into one-hit KOs, whereas if you've already used Archeops to put energy around your board, and your opponent targets the chops, you can then put Weirdeer into play and move energy onto these other Pokemon that you've scattered your energy around onto to still reach really high damage output. Another pretty tricksy Pokemon that could come into the deck list is Wellspring Ogerpon EX. The Torrential Pump is similar to the Iron Hands in that it's another way that you could take multiple prize knockouts on some setup decks in the opening turns. For 1 water, 2 colors, you deal 100 damage, but you may shuffle 3 energy attached to this Pokemon into your deck, and then if you do, you also deal 120 damage to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon. That's also a great way for you to preserve your legacy energy in these matchups that have lots of low hit point Pokemon to prey on, which means you can also get an attack in with Iron Hands EX later on in the game. Its first attack also can come in clutch in panic situations where the Sob can deny the opponent from retreating. We are very often playing double turbo energy in the list, so that could be a 0 damage attack, so we can have backdoor trapping plays in the deck as well. The final card I wanted to touch on was Pheasantipity EX. I'm trying to weave this card into all sorts of decks, and once again, this could be a useful card here. Even though we have gift energy in the deck list, Flip the Script can be a great way to safeguard ourselves around Temple of Sinnoh techs, Enhanced Hammer techs, or if the opponent is simply gusting around our gift energy, so that we can still draw extra cards in the late game. And of course, with the amazing acceleration of Archeops, we have to talk about the Cruel Arrow attack being an option here. It's 3 colorless energy, and you deal 100 to one of your opponent's Pokemon. You've certainly got more glamorous and flashy attacks in the deck, but on certain board states, this 100 damage, which could go to the bench, could be very powerful at taking out crucial threats on your opponent's side of the field. The first fleshed out 60 I'm going to look at is kind of like an Old Faithful build, which is basically No Thrills, a list that we've seen very similarly at the NAIC, where we're increasing the count of the Chinchino, adding in 1 copy of the 60 hit point Minchino as well here, because it does have a Call for Family attack if you happen to start this card, or if you're going second and have a Jet Energy play with early game Ball Search, you can get that Call for Family established, making sure you're guaranteeing multiple Lugia V, or just establishing a second Minchino. We've increased our supporter counts in Research as well as 1 copy of Carmine, because we have 2 Lumineon V in the deck. You may as well have the option for both in the list. And you can see there's 2 copies of Great Ball as well as Mezagoza in this 60. I've gone for this Stadium card just because at the end of the day, if you're not summoning, what's the point of playing Lugia? So you may as well give yourself as much percentage as possible. The other deck list that I think might be quite interesting does include that Pheasantipity EX in the list, and this is why you're seeing 2 copies of Nest Ball come into the 60 here. I've mirrored the additional support account, but I have changed the Iron Bundle and Fluttermane around in this instance, because having a Nest Ballable option for that bundle to make the most use out of it does seem pretty appealing. And once again, I'm picking Mezagoza. It actually is more important with a reduced Great Ball count in the list than playing Jamming Tower, I would think. Even though the list sacrifices physical counts of the Chinchino, because we are playing Nest Ball, we actually have additional amounts of guaranteed Minchino search on the opening turns. The headaches only really come in the fact that your opponent can take out these Minchino before they get to evolve, or if you have some awkward discards or prizing situations. Let's go into some matchups for Lugia then, and I do think the Regidrago is one of the bigger boasts. I think certainly when Lugia goes first into Regidrago and can use Tempest Dive to take the first 2 prize cards, you should be in a really good spot from that position, knowing that you have Boss's Orders plays available to you, and if you V-guarded your Lugia V-Star, that often is going to protect it from a Regidrago attack. But do be aware that Trifrost is an attack they might try and weave in this matchup if you get overzealous benching too many Minchino. I think Regidrago's best bet is going to be either playing their own copy of Temple of Sinnoh as their 1 Stadium choice, or have a combination of Gudra and Kyurem in their 60. If they're using Rolling Iron, they can try and make the Regidrago tank on certain turns, and it does set up a Trifrost option over a number of Pokemon, so you do want to be aware of where your missed energies are going. Sometimes you might end up having to put them on the Archeops themselves, so your opponent can't make a Trifrost play into some Dragapult sprinkle damage. Going second into the matchup, you will have to put down double Lugia, of course, but ultimately Regidrago's highest damage output options are always costly for them, so they're often going to look towards less efficient attacks in the matchup. Onto the Gardevoir matchup then. As we know, Iron Hands is a monster threat we can represent against Gardevoir, forcing them to have massive combinations all in one go with like counter catchers, enhanced hammers, all that sort of stuff. Do also be aware that Screamtail is often going to take out an Archeops as soon as it hits the board, so you definitely want to activate double Archeops as soon as you get them into play. Taking those multi-prize turns will be a priority for us, so also trying to weave in our Chinchino onto the Gardevoir itself would be absolutely massive. But know that if Gardevoir is going to Screamtail to take out an Archeops, they are trying to extend the game quite substantially, and they're looking to make catch-up plays with their Gardevoir EX, so an Iron Bundle could be a monster tech card for this matchup compared to the Fluttermane inclusion. Next up is the Charizard matchup. Similar to Gardevoir, we're going to try and be that pace setter, and it's going to be down to the Charizard player to create some combinations where they're using Counter Catcher and Burning Darkness to take out the Archeops. Ideally, Lugia itself is one of our better attackers in the opening stages because we know that a Burning Darkness can't KO us, and typically it's better to protect our Iron Hands for later turns in the game as our closing option. Another big boast of our deck, of course, is that Chinchino can KO Charizard and Pidgeot, and those are going to be incredible uptrade moments. Now that there is Dustoir in many of the Charizards, you do have to respect them if they've gone first and still establish double Lugia, because Dusclops blowing itself up will push the Burning Darkness into 0-hit KOs. Next up is the Raging Bolt matchup. As we know, they can be very aggressive, aggressive, and they do play lots of item gust here. So again, you want to develop multiple copies of Lugia in the opening stages, and ideally you lead out with a single prizer to make them hit heads on catchers or find their prime. Our main comeback mechanics are going to be the likes of Legacy Energy on our Blood Moon Ursaluna, or swinging in with a Chinchino for one-hit KOs. Bearing in mind also that Lugia V-Star can get into the action, provided you have boss's orders for some of their lower hit point multi-prizers. The Snorlax matchup is positive for us, but don't get carried away. They are teching quite heavily for the Lugia matchup because of how popular it is in the format. I would certainly expect high counts of Temple of Sinnoh, as well as oftentimes one copy of Giacomo in their list. So we do still have to be careful and not get too carried away with how many Pokemon we're attaching to here. The Handheld Fan is also a tech card they can use, and if you're really respecting control, that could be another reason for you to have Jamming Tower over the Mesagoza in your list. Naturally though, even if you are playing Jamming Towers, I still think it's a smarter move to wait on these stadium cards until you're bouncing Temple of Sinnohs, even if the opponent does have a handheld fan out. Next up is the Lost Zone box matchup, and this one can be terrifying with their Iron Thorns and Iron Hands both representing many threats here. Fluttermane could be a great card to just shove in the opening stages, not just to stop the initialization, but also to deny the Comfey draw. It's also important to respect the Greninja plus Sableye combos as well. This could be another situation where misting your Archeops makes sense after they've been damaged. And we also can't get carried away benching multiple Minccino at the same time either, because it could get instantly punished by a Radiant Greninja. Next up is the Dragapult matchup. This should be one of our easiest ones. I think it's much easier than Gardevoir and Charizard, because again, their Phantom Dive is just kind of ineffective into us when we are packing so many Mist Energy. It's very unlikely they can play Temple of Sinnoh, because they're often going to have their own Neo Upper Energy in the list, and it has big anti-synergy there. So I'd most likely expect an E-Hammer in their deck, if any tech at all. And even though E-Hammer can get rid of your A-Spec Legacy Energy, it's going to be far less troublesome than also getting around Mists and Gift Energy. So again, it's a matchup that I'm pretty content to see. You play it similarly to the Charizard matchup, just being a little bit more cautious with your Gift Energy, I think. For the Chien-Pao matchup, both of our decks can find multiple prize knockouts on every single turn of the game, so it really is a flat-out race. The good news is they typically don't play any answer to our Legacy Energy, so that can be a way that we can one-up our opponents by leaving a one-prize board that can KO a two-prize Pokemon. Whereas most of the time when Chien-Pao wants to take multiple prize knockouts, they have to use a two-prizer to do it. The Miraidon matchup is pretty abysmal. They have very early tempo plays, and they have Iron Hands, so even if we are trying to offset those prizes with attacking with Chinchino, it's not going to matter too much. I think our main hope here is going to be Blood Moon Ursaluna plus Legacy Energy as a combo, but your main win percentage in this matchup is going to be the old Iono and Prey if you're still in the game after the opening stages. On to my closing thoughts as Lugia. It was the most played deck at the NAIC for a reason, and even though it wasn't great at converting, it was still reasonable. There were still 46 in day 2 as the second most popular archetype. Just like at the NAIC, its matchup spread once again is looking very, very appealing, and I think it's more so down to playstyle and the way your opening turns play out that is the main thing putting some players off. To be honest with you, I think swallowing your pride and playing a deck like this at Worlds makes a ton of sense, to be honest. Because you're coming up against very high caliber players at every round at the World Championships, you have way less skill expression in this tournament. And it doesn't feel good to say, but getting luckier is a bigger factor at the World Championships than other events. Another boast of Lugia is you naturally have a lot of answers to the controlling matchups, so if you want to, you can commit every slot to just as much ball search as possible to get into the game. Unlike a lot of other archetypes in the format, either to choose to respect control and warp their deck quite substantially with a number of cards, which can harm their consistency, or they forego the matchup and end up having a really rough time trying to dodge at Worlds. The other thing worth remembering is that Lugia plays really well into a no-tie strategy at Worlds. You know pretty easily when things are going badly for Lugia. Did you summon on turn 2 or not? Is there only one Archeops in play? What's your prize race looking like? If you're not already 2 or 3 prizes ahead against some of these setup decks, you know you're having a bad time and it's worth picking up the cards at that point. Whereas when things are going well, you're taking multi-prize KOs with your Chinchinos and your Iron Hands, and in both of these situations, the games are going quickly, so you're very often able to complete 3 games as long as you're being disciplined, knowing when you're behind. It seems like Lugia is its own worst enemy, as always, because there really aren't too many high-profile bad matchups. I'd like to hear your thoughts on the archetype down below. How does it feel committing the whole season, working hard to make it to the World Championships, and then putting your faith in the cards like Capturing Aroma? It's easy from the outside looking in when I have no stake here, but I think Lugia personally is a pretty strong play for the World Championships, and I wouldn't begrudge anyone for picking it. Swallowing your pride to give yourself just the best chance to win on paper is no bad thing at all. Let me know your thoughts down below, and I'll see you tomorrow for another video. Cheers.